So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for making the time. I know it's Friday, and maybe the session is the last thing between you and the weekend. So I know it's not always easy at the end of the week to keep on top of everything, so do appreciate the effort. So today's session is going to be much more informal than the formal lectures that we've had earlier this week. And the idea is that over the course of the next 90 minutes, we'll have an opportunity to reflect on some of the things we talked about and to encourage the sharing of ideas and thoughts and views about some of those issues. So to guide the discussion, I have put together 3 broad questions. And I think that Lauren has this afternoon resent all those on the chat, so it's very easy for everyone to see those. So in terms of the program for today, I will speak for a few minutes and just remind everyone about some of the substantive issues that we covered that are relevant to these questions. And then we will break out into 2 groups, one led by Dr. Gao, and he will be working with one half of the class and working particularly closely with who will help with the facilitating of the discussion and in summarizing the views when we return to plenary session. And at the same time, I will be working with we will be doing the same thing. And then we will be able to compare notes, as it were, at the end. So please be relaxed. I don't think there's any real right or wrong answers. The questions are designed to encourage everyone to sort of think and to just reflect on some of the broader issues that we have touched upon. So we will then conclude the plenary session. I will say a few words at the end. I'm not sure there'll be specific conclusions, but I will conclude the session for the day. So that's the program. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and that's the program for the day. So we have 3 questions that I've distributed. So the first is we are going to ask ourselves, what are the underlying reasons for the emergence of international financial institutions as part of the development architecture? What explains their proliferation? So we spent some time yesterday, and in fact on the first lecture as well, talking about the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is part of the World Bank Group. And we talked about how critical the year 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference, was for international development, and particularly for the financing of international development. So that is the World Bank is really the classic international financial institution in the sense that it's an international organization that is financing specific projects and specific programs, as opposed to general balance of payment lending, which is what the IMF does. And while it's important to have an understanding of the IMF, we noted that going forward for our lectures, we would really say goodbye to the IMF and focus very much on the World Bank and the international institutions which followed. And then we talked about those institutions, and we noted that the IFC had came into existence because of the recognition that more needs to be done to support the involvement of the private sector in development. And we then also saw that that a number of regional development banks were established, with the first one being the Inter-American Development Bank, followed by the African Development Bank, and then the Asian Development Bank, and then much later by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And so all of these are classic regional development banks, so their focus is to support a region, and they are confined to investing in that region. And then we noted that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which came along more recently, sort of defies an easy definition. So in one sense, it's a regional development bank because it is set out to support the development of a specific region of the world, namely Asia, very expensively defined, as we discussed yesterday. But it's a little bit global in the sense that to achieve that purpose, the institution is able to invest in all of its member countries, and exceptionally it can invest outside as well. And the number of members that it has now surpasses that of all the regional development banks, and it's a little way off from having the number of members that the World Bank has or that IFAD has, but nonetheless, it is increasingly global. We then noted that there are a few other institutions that have also been established since the Bretton Woods moment, and we noted that IDA is an institution which was set up because it was recognized that there was a real need for concessional financing and for grant financing. And we looked at the establishment of IFAD also, and we noted how it had arisen at a time of the world oil crises, plural, and how the organization was channeling the funds from the recently enriched oil-producing countries, so those in the Gulf in particular, to support development and to do that in a way that was going to give these contributors much greater say in how the organizations that they are supporting would be run. So that's a sort of brief recap of the evolution of the various international financial institutions. And so what you are asked to do in relation to this question during the breakout session is to reflect on what are the underlying reasons for these international financial institutions to emerge, and why are there so many of them. We've not really discussed the regional development banks, the smaller banks. In the written materials that have been distributed, you've seen that there is a long list of some of these. We've not really talked about those, but you could touch on those in your discussion, but I would recommend that we focus on the major international financial institutions which we have discussed to date. So that's the first question. Now, the second question, we note that most international financial institutions, they're expressly prohibited from taking into account the political character of the borrowing state or the state that is hosting the project being financed by the institution. The institution is only allowed to take into account economic considerations when making their investment decisions. And we noted also that an exception to this rule is that of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where it can only make decisions where the borrowing country or the country hosting the project being financed is committed to certain liberal ideals, specifically democracy, pluralism, and market economics. And we talked a bit about the EBRD yesterday, and I explained how that institution arose in response to the coming to an end of the Cold War and for the need for the countries emerging from Soviet domination then needed support to integrate into the international economic community. And I explained also how those liberal ideals which are entrenched in the charter of the EBRD can be explained by the history that gave rise to the establishment of the EBRD, and how it reflected also the fact that these liberal views had really triumphed at that moment in time over the competing view that was being espoused by those countries which formed part of the Soviet bloc, and in particular that the way to organize societies was to mandate in a prescriptive way every element of it, including commanding how the economy should be run. And so that particular view of how society should be organized was ideologically defeated by the liberal view of how society should be organized. And that's reflected in the charter of the institution. So rather sort of specific reason for the EBRD both coming about and it adopting this political conditionality, which is completely different from what happens at the other institutions. But of course, even in modern times, all these liberal democracies are well respected, including by the United Nations, and I think that market economics is recognized by economists and politicians and international relations experts, lawyers and others as really being the critical way to support development. So in the breakout session, you're asked to reflect on whether it is more attractive from a development perspective to be blind to anything other than economic considerations when making investment decisions, or whether it would serve development better if some kind of considerations other than just economic considerations were taken into account when making investment decisions, whether along the lines of the EBRD or otherwise. So that's the question that you're asked to reflect on during the breakout session, the second question. The third question you're asked to reflect on arises from the discussion that we had yesterday, in which we said we would return to in a later lecture. And this relates to how votes are allocated. So sometimes in shorthand form, we refer to how shares are allocated. I don't think we have to get into a technical discussion about the distinction between shares carrying voting rights and the allocation of voting rights without any shares. No need to focus on that sort of technical distinction. The important thing here is just to consider an issue about the correct allocation of voting rights. And as we noted yesterday, the general principle at international organizations is that every member, which are usually countries, every member gets the same say as every other member. So there is an equality of treatment in that respect. And we saw, for example, at the General Assembly of the United Nations, the most inclusive body that we have in the world, every state, no matter how large its economy or no matter how politically influential, it has the same vote as the smallest economies and the least influential countries in the world. And we gave the example of the United States and the Cook Islands, both having the same vote at the UN. We noted that, of course, it's more complex in the UN system generally when you take into account how the Security Council operates. But leaving that aside, the general principle in international organizations is one country, one vote. And then we saw that when dealing with international financial institutions, which is a subset of the world of international organizations, then the approach is very different. And the approach is that in broad terms, the amount of influence as reflected in the voting power that a member has is a function of their economic strength. So that's the general principle. We noted too that one of the dilemmas in international governance is that it's important to give the very small economies, the very small states, those with limited influence, some voice in decision-making, particularly if those decisions are going to implicate those countries very directly. For example, if an international institution is going to be considering financing a project on the territory of one of those countries. And one way in which to give voice to those smaller countries is by setting aside a certain number of shares or a certain number of votes in an organization and then spreading them evenly across the institution so that all members, large and small, get the same number of votes. And here we noted that at the AIIB, 12% of the shares are set aside for this purpose. They're called basic shares, and these are distributed evenly over all of the members. And so the largest member, China, would get the same voice as the smallest member, which I think is the Cook Islands. So we observed those very different approaches, and we talked a little bit about what has stimulated the thinking behind having those differences. And one important element was the need for the organizations to protect their capital and to limit the risk of the members being called upon to provide additional funding for the institution if the institution is unable to pay its obligations. So those were some of the considerations behind a different kind of structure for the international financial institutions. And so in the breakout session, in the third discussion of the third question, you were asked to reflect on this and to think about whether you feel this makes sense or whether it's better to have one uniform approach for all institutions, irrespective of whether international financial institutions or not, or whether having something along the lines of what currently exists is the preferable system. And if so, how does one deal with the issue of providing voice to the least developed countries, or those with the smallest economies or the smallest amount of economic clout? So please go, we should break up now into our two groups. Dr. Gao will lead one and I will lead the other, and we should give ourselves 45 minutes so we can have 15 minutes for each of the three questions, and then we will come back together, and then we will share our different views on going each question one by one, and then I will make a few concluding comments at the end. Does anyone have any questions on any of that? Okay, so on the assumption that silence means everyone understands, we can now go into our separate workout sessions. So we had a very good discussion in our breakout group, and I'm sure sure that you did as well in the group led by Dr. Gao. And so my suggestion is that we just go through each of these questions and we maybe ask, we could start with from my group, who could just sort of share a few thoughts on the first question, and then we could ask to share the thinking of his group on that question as well. And as we know, this is the question about what explains the evolution of the international financial institution and why the proliferation. So would you like to say a few words?
Okay, our group thinks that World War II is a key event that drives the emergence of international financial institutions globally. Because during the Great Depression, the economy depended heavily on the state intervention. And because of that failure of state interventionism, regional and international cooperation was deemed to be a better alternative. And as for proliferation, we think that could be largely attributed to the regional cooperation, especially among the post-colonialism countries, because likewise they had no other better alternative than seeking help from international and regional development banks. Yeah, that wraps up our discussion.
Thank you. Well, would you like to sort of summarize the views of your group on this question?
Okay, and so our group also focused on the historical context, and then first we discussed the impact of World War II and also the Great Depression. And so the related to the Great Depression, so block economy, it's the key factor and the first key factor in the history. And then instead of the post-colonialized countries, we focused on the leading countries, and such as the US or the Western part, Western European countries. Then, so like I'm just summing up. And so we come up with some several keywords like interdependence or dependence on the leading countries, or so dominance of the US in the economy, or dominance of the dollars instead of gold system. So so we focus on such an aspect, and actually we didn't conclude it so explicitly, and we listened to the Professor Gao's explanation about the gold system and the dollar center system and its impact on the global economy. So we are actually still in the middle of discussion, but I felt that switch to the dollar center system from the gold system is one of the key which generated inequality among countries. And also, and in the midst of the World War II, and the fact that the US had very strong power, or also in the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that dominance of US country will be strengthened. And then recently, as China's dominance in the IT sectors, or some China-US trade war, will be some latent power of some inequality or instability among global economy. And then there become a need, so there exists, and brain brought about the need, necessity of control over the economy, instead of relying on the free market, free power of the economy. And then and also with combined with some crisis, oil crisis or food crisis, and so new funds will be necessary to control the global financial market. I'm very sorry, I couldn't conclude very well.
No, thank you very much. That was very helpful. So one thing that I think came out of your comments, which sort of I think would resonate with our group as well, is the influence of the world's largest economy and the largest power, particularly at the end of the Second World War. And it's hard actually to overstate just how influential the US was at that moment in history. So economically, I read somewhere that in 1945, I think the US accounted for about 3% of the world's population, but about 60% of the world's global economic activity. It's extraordinary, right? So, and in fact, as I mentioned, I think in the first lecture or the second lecture, the reason that, or part of the reason why the conference was held at Bretton Woods is because no other country really had the capacity to host an international conference. They didn't have that ability to do that. Such was the parlous state of the world. So of course the US was a massive influence in the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions, and it's been quite influential in the other ones as well. But I wouldn't overstate it. I mean, we talked about that in our group, that the US was a key driver in the development of these institutions. I think it's probably more nuanced than that. I think if you look at the EBRD, the US was very much against the establishment of the EBRD when it was first floated as a European proposal. But when it was clear that the institution would be established anyway, they then insisted on coming in with the single largest shareholding. So in the case of the Asian Development Bank, equally, at the outset, they had their misgivings about the creation of such an institution. But when it was clear that there was going to be such an institution, they then mustered in and made sure that along with Japan, they would have the largest shareholding. And at the AIIB, as I mentioned, the Obama administration at the time actively lobbied its allies not to participate in the AIIB, an effort that they really failed in by and large. So I think the US is certainly a key player, and it's the politics behind the establishment of all these organizations definitely involves the US to one degree or another, simply by virtue of how influential that country was in the past, certainly after the end of the Second World War, and probably at the time of the collapse of the Cold War. Those are the two moments when it was probably most in the ascendant, and the institutions that came into being, or the policies that were adopted at that time, or the Washington Consensus that we talked about, all of these things sort of reflect the degree of power of the US at that time. So let's move on to our second question. Actually, but before I do that, let me actually ask Dr. Gao, did you want to add anything to the discussion on the first question?
Thank you, Gerard. First, I would like to apologize for being too talkative in my session. That's why I didn't really finish the last question. I think already very well summarized all the key points we discussed on the first question. So we also discussed the example of EBRD, the example of IFIs, how they were created in that particular social and economic and political context. yeah, nothing to add here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gao. So let's move to the second question. On this one, on this question, why don't we ask, why don't you start this time, and then we come with Dan Hui afterwards.
Yeah, so the question 2 is very difficult to answer straightly. So yeah, we couldn't discuss so much about that. But so the goal of the economic financial system is to achieve economic success and sustainable investment in a country, and especially when the country is premature in economy or its so democracy or political systems, maybe we have to consider the political aspect more, and we focus on some such constraint. So we have to impose such some constraint on the political system for political level. But if the country, if the target country of the funding has matured or some could reach some level of politics, maybe we can focus on only economic, or we do not focus on other aspects so much. But and it's very difficult to answer. So yes, as for this point, we also asked Professor Gao to explain the cases of the Africans, so South African circumstances, or such as funding in the era of apartheid, or something like that. And then our group could know that. So yeah, and so the which aspect we have to we should focus on depends on the time, so depends on some circumstances, and of course, so fund, international fund is economical organization. In some cases, we can only focus on economic situations and neglect the political difficulties or political obstacles. But so politics and economy is closely related to each other. So in many cases, maybe the organization, maybe international funds have to focus both on the economic and political or social context. Yes, that's it.
Thank you very much. Dan Hui, would you like to say a few words? By the way, I can see why you ran out of time if you landed up talking about apartheid in South Africa impacting on some of the larger issues. A fascinating subject, but please.
So our group all agree that no prohibition would be better, in that the purpose of development banks is to promote economic cooperation independent of political state. So we believe that decision making should be purely based on financial need, not on the political state. And one reason we have for that is that the member states that in the most need for financial loans are mostly post-colonial countries. And those countries tend to have authoritarian leaders as a result of their traumatized political landscape. And it's not like a responsibility that they should burden in their financial development of the country. And also another reason is that any kind of political state, be it democratic or like communistic, and they are all like equally susceptible to authoritarian, to corruption, to the misuse of loans or financial resources. And like it's not fair to penalize one kind of political state over another. So like we think one way better around is to consult with different sectors of the borrowing country instead of judging from their political state. And also during our discussion, Professor Sanders points out that such decision-making depends on the nature of membership as well. In most international and regional development banks, the decision made have to be capable of being supported by all membership universally. So in that sense, the decision is a reflection of the like-minded value of the club instead of like individual member countries. So to conclude, our group agreed that the ideal state would be decision-making is purely based on economy, but in practice, some political consideration has to be included for now.
And I think we also talked about how it's not so easy to just take economic considerations into account. And the example we discussed was the issue of corruption, that it's very difficult to be blind to lending money to a country if you think that all it's going to be doing is propping up an abhorrent regime, particularly one that is spending all of the state's funds on its own sort of pet projects that may not be doing much good for the population as a whole, but simply supports the ruling elite or maybe even an individual dictator. Dr. Gao, I think this is the second. I think you touched on this question in your discussion.
Yes, Gerard. So our team, I guess, fully agree with you that in the legal text, it's very clear that only economic considerations shall be taken into account in the decision making in MDBs, except EBRD, which has a very different mandate, very special mandate. However, in practice, it's not always easy to find out or to draw a line between economic considerations and non-economic considerations. Just a few examples. Governance, as you said, corruption. So governance is not purely economic, but it is so closely linked to a country's economic development. And this is also why in 1980s, the World Bank started policy lending to improve governance in those borrowing member countries. Another example could be human rights. So when the World Bank, IMF, when they were created, human rights was not really such a buzzword in international law and in the international community. But that is somehow why we saw such exchange of affairs between the UN and the Secretary General for Legal Affairs and the World Bank's General Council on the lending from the World Bank to South Africa in 1960s. But after that, human rights law has developed, in a significant way. It is referred to everywhere. And no international organization can simply claim that it has nothing to do with my mandate. I'm not focusing on human rights. Nobody would say that, at least since probably 1980s. So human rights are reflected in so many policies in MDBs. For example, the social rights, for example, gender equality, but probably they are not purely economic, but they do have some link to economic considerations. So the same legal term, economic considerations, but the interpretation of that legal term has evolved over the decades. The scope, the content, I have to say, are very different from half a century ago. Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you very much. So this brings us to the last question. So would you like to share our views on this? I understand that the other team didn't have a chance to look at this too much, so we can follow your comments by any comments they may have on your comments. Go ahead, Tianhui.
Yes, we think the two kinds of voting weightage system is actually a power imbalance versus practicality kind of debate. And if we give votes weightage based on the size of economy, then inevitably it will result in kind of power imbalance. The bigger economy will have like dominance over the smaller ones. But in contrast, the bigger economies will have more responsibility in investing as well. Like with greater power, there comes greater responsibility kind of thing. And on the other hand, in practice, it's easier to assign vote weightage according to the size of economy, because especially in regional cooperation, because when we factor in the size of economy, it's easier to calculate, to like to invest the projects based on the size of economy and based on the market mechanism. And another thing we talk about is that like the officials, the nature of officials appointed to the board of international financial institutions. For example, some countries tend to appoint finance ministers to such organization, while some other countries tend to appoint like agricultural or like transportation ministers to those organizations, and that shows like a difference in the priorities of different countries, and that might have something to do with like what kind of negotiation power they have in international financial institutions as well.
And I think, Tianhui, we also talked about the role that the capital contributions that members make has in relation to the influence that they have. So we noted that unlike say the international organizations generally, if the international financial institutions are not able to meet their obligations, then the members have to pay an additional capital. They have to pay the amount of callable capital that they've committed to. And this then will disproportionately fall on the countries with the largest economies. And so linked to that is your earlier point about what kind of officials are being sent to these institutions, and within the capitals, which kind of departments are most influential in making decisions. So is it the finance ministries which are particularly concerned about the limiting the exposure of their country to having to meet the unpaid liabilities of the institution to preserve the capital? Or is it the development ministries or maybe foreign affairs ministries that are particularly concerned about pursuing a view of development? So Dr. Gao, or any thoughts on any of this?
Okay, so our group couldn't reach this question, so I'll give briefly my opinion about the question 3. Okay, so considering the global financial institutions is established to help the economically weak countries and restrict the powerful countries' dominance in the economy, I think that votes should be distributed evenly to the countries, because I think the organization should emphasize weak countries, or less influential countries. Leading countries, economically leading countries can control their economy, not by the negotiation or so, just by controlling the market economically, not through negotiation or not through the institutions, so global financial institutions. So I think in this kind of organization, votes should be distributed evenly. And also, technically, I think it's very difficult to measure the economic powers of the country. Like which measures, which indicators should be used to measure the economic influences of the country, like GDPs or some other indicators. So it's very difficult and very controversial to define the measures of the indicators. And so I think the votes should be distributed evenly. Maybe so, yeah, like as a way of compromise, maybe we can set some vetoes if needed, or in very selected, very specified conditions.
So let me ask you a question. I'm sure you're going to go on to do great things in your career. Let's say that you become the Minister of Finance of Japan. And an official comes to you with a proposal and says there is a proposal to have a new international financial institution. And it's a regional organization. It's going to be looking at an area of interest, a geographical area of interest to Japan. Let's say Central Asia. So I know that Japan, for example, has had a long history in supporting Uzbekistan. But let's say that there's going to be a new international organization that will support Central Asia, and Japan would become a member of it. So you are the Minister of Finance, and the official says that the Development Ministry thinks this is a brilliant idea, but of course it needs to be funded. Japan, by far and away, has the largest economy, so it will have to put in 50% of all of the money that is needed. And the official would then say to you that they were looking back in the archives of some recorded discussion from the University of Tokyo years ago, and they noted that you supported the idea of equal votes. And so the proposal now is that Japan will provide 50% of all of the capital, and there are, let's say, 10 countries, and Japan, like everyone else, will have 1/10 of the votes. And also, if things go wrong and the organization is badly run or makes bad decisions, and if there is a liability to be met, then Japan will have to meet 50% of the liability. And then the official would say to you, are you happy to provide the funds on the basis that you will provide 50% of the funds, you will be liable for 50% of all of the losses of the institution, but you will have only 10% of the votes. What would you say then?
Yeah, so yeah, so that's so shortcoming of my idea. It's that so like not evenly separate the votes. So even if we separate the vote evenly, the structure weakness will be given. So the structure of the decision making of the organization will be weaker, because the dominating power does not work well, and maybe so like so a very important decision will not be decided quickly. So it's very difficult.
Well, I liked your idea of having some kind of safeguards. I think you mentioned having a veto over some decisions. So maybe it would be possible. Maybe your initial idea could still hold. So Japan would put in 50% of the contribution and be responsible for 50% of the liabilities up to a certain amount, and only have 10% of the voting power. But there could be, for example, an informal understanding or even a formal one that Japan always gets to provide the presidency, always gets to provide the president. So you have informal arrangements like that in some of the other institutions. These are criticized because the governance is not modern in that respect, but this could be one sort of check on the system. Another one could be that there would be vetoes over important decisions, such as increasing the capital, or such as certain key strategies or key policies, or even key investment types. All of these would have to be agreed by all of the members. There'd have to be unanimity. So these are possibilities. But I think it's a good question to discuss, because it underscores how difficult the questions are that have to be asked and answered when designing these kind of institutions and when running them. So thank you very, very much. Dr. Gao, would you have any contribution, or you feel we've thrashed this one sufficiently?
I think this question has been properly addressed.
Okay, very good. I was worried that you were going to introduce apartheid South Africa into this discussion as well.
I tried very hard not to do so.
Okay, very good. So look, thank you. I think this has been a great conversation that we've had now, and I'm sure you had that in the other team and during your breakout session, and we certainly had a good discussion in ours as well. So thank you very much, and for your contributions, both in the breakout session and the session here today. So I would not attempt to draw any conclusions, but maybe by way of concluding remarks, I would say that I think that what this discussion really highlights is that, this is not a sort of a clinical subject where there are clearly right and wrong answers and everything is black and white. There's lots of nuance. There are a lot of value judgments that are not immediately known, but which underpin a lot of the decisions, including the establishment of the organizations and how they're organized. Politics plays a big role. I think when we look at the decision of how do you allocate voice, how do you preserve the capital, particularly for those countries that are making the greatest capital contributions, and yet how do you ensure equitable decision-making, especially on the part of those who may not be providing the capital, but are providing the opportunities for the projects to be built on their territory. So how do you reconcile all those competing interests? And I think it's really politics that determines that. But of course, politics can be informed by rational decision-making, and can be informed rather by rational arguments, and by evidence-based arguments, and also by looking at history. What have we learned from the experience of the other institutions? And I think one thing that we see is that every new international financial institution learns from the institutions that have preceded it. So we will see in a future class how the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is the most recent of the large international financial institutions, in many respects represents a continuation of all of those things that work well in the other international organizations. But it also represents an institution that has adopted a number of innovations in order to build on what has preceded it and to do some things in a more modern or effective manner. So we will look at that in one of the next classes. But for now, let me thank you all very much for participating. I see Professor Sato has joined us a little while ago. Professor Sato, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry to miss almost a very important part of the discussion. In fact, I was occupied by the oral examination of master's degree, so I cannot participate in the course. But yeah, I realized that very fruitful discussion, and the students participated quite good. And this especially curious in some political elements, in fact. And yeah, as Gerard already discussed the history of this institution, financial institution, international financial institution. It actually is a part of the political sort of initiative, especially the United States of America after the war, as World Bank, their name is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, reconstruction from the war, in fact, and so on. The UN is also one wing of the political institution. The World Bank, this group is an economic group for the development to promote sort of this post World War II world. But both, of course, located in the USA and New York and also Washington. So that was the consensus. So Bretton Woods suggests that post World War II, the American hegemony for all these rules and orders and any economic rules, something like that. So interestingly, this AIIB fact just a new challenge by the China, which is emerging the economy it's very controversial in the case of Asia, especially Japan. Some other neighboring countries are very much we are not well known how this going on the future. So in this sense, kind of anxiety in the one sense, but also some sort of a possible new world. In fact, Asia is a very diverse, of course, in the value of culture, history, and of course some sort of level of the economic situation. So it's very difficult. We have already ADBs, so how the AIB and work with ADB or the other institutions in this sort of quite interesting historically. So I'm very happy to join next week for the AIB's, the raison d'être and their, mission and sort of visions and so on. Also many Chinese students here and there, and also some American students there, a Japanese one. Also very much, good for sort of a participation. Appreciate. Maybe see you next week for continued discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and look forward to seeing everybody again on Tuesday. Is that right, Lauren? Next week?
Yeah.
It's the same. Very good. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
and we see you all next Tuesday.